I decided a few weeks ago to dress the part when talking about some high complication Patek Philippe's, and since that video was so successful on this channel, and by that I mean it's probably the worst performing video on the page for a very long time, maybe the suit will make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. We will see. Omega's Chrono Chime is worth talking about. The internet, social media has been abuzz with this watch, specifically talking about its specifications, what it entails, what the brand has managed to do. But no one seems to be asking the fundamental question of why did Omega create this watch in the first place? What is the point? What kind of area is this watch filling? I mean, realistically, this watch is going to be produced in such small batch numbers, we will never see it in the wild. It's going to be so unique of a watch that it's bordering on being a piece unique. But it's a worthy question. Why does this watch actually exist? Contemplating the existence of a watch and a complication as extraordinary as this, I think, makes for a better conversation and a bit more of a thought piece. I'm not saying that I have the answer to this, I probably don't. But if we take a step back and we compare Omega as a brand to its contemporaries, a lot of them rest on their laurels. They don't necessarily push the development of watchmaking too far. They prefer to use marketing, brand identity, their history to propel the name and the image further forward. There's nothing wrong with that. Most companies do that today. But with Omega, and the reason why I am so passionate about this brand in particular, they have so much open area for creative experimentation when it comes to their designs, their aesthetics, ergonomics. But watchmaking has always been at the core of what they do. It's a maker that embraced George Daniels' coaxial escapement technology. That in itself is a marvel. It's a brand that is looking at meta certification above and beyond COSC chronometer certification to approve their watches. It's a brand that not only creates its own movements in-house, but also creates its own proprietary materials and metals. Simply put, the reason why I love Omega so much as a brand, why it is brilliant, is it's because it's not one that settles down. It likes to go the extra mile. And an example of a complication like this just shows you what it's capable of. Let's start by talking about complications just to put everything into perspective. We start with days and dates on top of time telling. Then we go into areas of annual calendars, perpetual calendars. We go to chronographs, split-second chronographs, Rattrapant. And as we move up the echelons and tiers, we eventually arrive at the tourbillon and the minute repeater. Arguably today, the tourbillon is one of the most useless complications that you can get in your watch, but it is technologically incredible. It's a modification of the escapement. There are so many small little bits of technology involved in that process, but arguably the most incredible high complication you can get today is the minute repeater. It is both ridiculous and incredible at the same time, and its origins stem from a very practical application. I mean, in the late 1700s, 1800s, you didn't have lighting in your house, you had candles. So your house was pretty dark in the evenings, especially during the winter months. Now, in order to tell the time in your house, you had a grandfather clock that was sitting somewhere, and that used to be able to chime the hour every hour, which was pretty practical. But of course, this concept, this technology got watchmakers thinking. Let's create a complication that chimes the hours and the minutes. Let's put it in a pocket watch. Now, back then, even today, it's a complication that is so overboard, it's priced in a similar bracket. It was only ever created for the wealthy. And what makes it so superior and incredible from a practicality point of view, no matter what time of the day, no matter where you are in your house or if you're traveling somewhere, if you're in a meeting or at an appointment and you don't want people to know that you're checking the time, you can just hands-free chime it in your pocket and work out what time it is. It's such a sophisticated movement, and the whole concept and story around it is brilliant. So putting it in a wristwatch today is even more extreme because, of course, tolerances have to be even better. You're dealing with smaller and smaller cases. Alongo & Zono, for example, has just created an incredible minute repeater, probably one of the best of all time, platinum case, in the Richard Lunger collection. It's an absolute work of art. This complication is seen today to belong to the most prominent, the most important watch brands in the world. It's highly coveted and highly priced because of what it represents, but also because it calls back to an older time and really is the purest form of watchmaking there is. Unlike lots of other complications, the tourbillon for example, this is a complication which has practicality at the heart of it. And for a wristwatch, it's an incredible thing. So you're probably asking yourself, why the context, why all the background? Talk about the Omega. The Chrono Chime aims to be something different, and I didn't realize this until I had a good look and a good study of it. This is a coaxial, split-second chronograph that has a minute repeater, but the minute repeater chimes the hours and the minutes of the chronograph complication. Now, why is that practical in today's sense? We can read the time pretty easily on our watches, especially when they are pretty well sized, when they have good contrast, good backgrounds. We have a lot of light around us today. But when it comes to reading subdials on a chronograph, that can be a bit of a pain, especially when you're dealing with hours and minutes. Omega's aim with the 1932 caliber and the Chrono Chime is to create a watch that makes the reading of a chronograph all the more enjoyable. You no longer have to study the subdials to determine the elapsed time. You can hear it chimed to you. Now bear in mind, this is Omega. This is not Patek Philippe, Vacheron, Audemars Piguet, Lange & Söhne. The names continue. This is not a haute horology brand, but this is the first brand to have ever created this complication. Nearly 600 individual components, a total of 17 new patents. It took the brand over 3 years to collaborate with Blancpain, creating this complication. To expand further on the complexity of this watch, it's a 5 Hz movement, so it's able to calculate a tenth of a second. It's also a coaxial movement. It's META certified. It's got a 60-hour power reserve, completely anti-magnetic. So it's got all of the technology that Omega has improved over the years and more. The downside is that, of course, the watch will be extra thick. I think it's well over 14 millimeters in size, and its diameter is 45 millimeters, but I mean, all of this is quite irrelevant since we will probably never be able to see one of these in our lives. You're asking yourself, yes, it's not appealing to everybody, it's overkill. This is still a first. This is them proving to the big names, Jaeger-LeCoultre and many others, that they can in fact do this sort of thing. Now, since we've been spending most of the time talking about the movement, these watches are made to celebrate Omega and the Olympics. Since 1932, they've been involved. They've been the official timekeeper, the official partner. So not only have they created a watch that's very faithful to the original pocket watch of the time, but they've also released a CK-inspired case with a Speedmaster aesthetic, just to give you a bit more of a modern edge. Both of these watches using Sedna gold, an insane amount of gold in the movement and throughout. And of course it doesn't stop there. With the Speedmaster it's using an aventurine dial, aventurine bezel, and when we look across to the 1932 pocket watch, it's using a Grand Faux enamel dial, beautiful blued hands, and both of these models having the gongs of the minute repeater on display. These pieces are a celebration. They celebrate the complexity of the movement that Omega has now created, also celebrating the anniversary that Omega has shared with the Olympic Committee as a partner. What makes this launch even more fascinating to me is we look a couple of months back to the MoonSwatch controversy. How the Swatch Group has created a sample of a watch out of bioceramic with a quartz movement. You know, it's an odd thing. It's still a topic of debate. And then you look to the other end of the spectrum. You see the Speedmaster being used again as an example, but this time, with its recognizable aesthetic, now debuting a haute horology, the highest of complications, and all belong under that same banner of Omega. Now, since not many of us are interested in pocket watches, I might not talk too much about the watch, but the question is, we look at the Speedmaster representation. Do I like what they've done with it? Do I like the aesthetics? Do I like where the pushes are placed? No, I don't. I do feel it's a bit overkill, if I'm being honest. Of course it has to be for such a significant watch, but I'm someone who's more interested in the subtlety of things. I would have preferred to have seen it in white gold or platinum, something a little bit more discreet. But then again, when we're talking about minute repeaters, we're also talking about the resonance of the materials, and the Sedna gold obviously has its own unique tone, and they're using this as the material to not only highlight it's their own, but at the same time also to highlight what it sounds like. I'm quite conflicted with the choice of Speedmaster. We're talking about a chronograph, so of course it makes perfect sense. But seeing a complication like this debuted, I would have loved to have seen it debuted in a CK859 sort of case, sector dial aesthetic. Maybe that's just me, maybe that's a bit too far in the traditionalist camp. Should the Speedmaster have looked more like a Speedmaster? Should have all the pushes been on the one side? Yes and no. The problem with such a recognizable property and design is that it can get muddled and mixed in their own huge collection of Speedmasters that they offer. So offsetting the pusher on the one side for the chime, it's pretty good. It's different. It does let it stand out. You know, these are beautiful watches. Beautiful because they represent something truly special, not only in the area of horology, but in the area of what Omega is capable of doing as a maker. Is there something we could compare this watch to in a real life sense? Going back to that question again of why did they go so far? Why did they create this movement in the first place? I liken it to a marathon runner. The runner has just finished a 3-hour race and interviewed post-run. They say, why do you do this? And the answer will most likely be, because I can. Hard to argue with that.